Good evening, and welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Stacy Dutton. I am a member, a fan, and a supporter of the Free Library. My home branch is Lovett in Mount Airy, but I'm here at Central Branch often. Yay, Mount Airy! I'm here at Central Branch often, like many of you, I imagine, for special events and author talks. As you saw in the video that just aired, the Free Library is dedicated to advancing literacy, guiding learning, and inspiring curiosity each and every day at 61 locations across the city of Philadelphia. Before I introduce David Brooks, I would like to ask you to take a moment to silence your cell phones and to remind you that no flash photography is permitted during this evening's events. Following David's talks, he will sign books upstairs in the lobby. Please don't forget that most of our author events are offered as podcasts at freelibrary.org. So if you enjoyed this evening's talk, you can listen to it again or recommend it to friends. Many of the Free Library's most beloved programs and crucial services are made possible only with your support. A gift of any size, whatever you feel comfortable offering, helps the Free Library to transform lives. Please make your gift online at freelibrary.org. And remember, no gift is too large. Tonight it is my honor to introduce the acclaimed New York Times columnist and best-selling author, David Brooks. David is also one of my oldest friends, so it is a special pleasure to be here this evening with him and with all of you. David is regarded as a sophisticated conservative who marches to his own drummer. Many of you know him as the resident conservative on the op-ed pages of the New York Times, where he has written a twice-weekly column since 2003. He was also a founding editor and columnist at the Weekly Standard and has practiced journalism at the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic Monthly, and the Washington Times. David's books include, and these are mouthfuls, Bobos in Paradise, The New Upper Class and How They Got There, published in 2000, On Paradise Drive, How We Live Now and Always Have in the Future Tense, published in 2004, and The Social Animal in 2011. He is a commentator on PBS NewsHour and frequently contributes to Meet the Press and National Public Radio's All Things Considered. His latest book, The Road to Character, is an exploration of struggle, character building, and the path toward living a more examined life. According to the New York Times Book Review, The Road to Character is a hyper-readable, lucid, often richly detailed human story. In the age of the selfie, Brooks wishes to exhort us back to a semi-classical sense of self-restraint, self-erasure, and self-suspicion. Before I turn the podium over to David, I would like to close with a short personal story. David and I met in September of 1979, two first-year college students at the University of Chicago. David was a newly minted graduate of Radnor High School, a mere 13 miles due west of where we sit right now, if you go straight out Lancaster Avenue. And I was from Washington, D.C. We were two East Coast refugees feeling a little bit out of our element on the south side of Chicago, and along with a third friend from Manhattan, we three amigos became fast friends. At some point, our New York friend became interested in boxing. I don't recall why, and he decided to apply the University of Chicago method to his new interest. That method, I almost hesitate to mention, consisted of a great deal of reading about boxing and not a lot of actual training. A few months later, our friend, David and I, found ourselves in a packed gym in a sketchy neighborhood in northwest Chicago at a Golden Gloves tournament. Our friend entered the ring. David and I caught our breaths, fearing for his health and well-being. The referee mercifully ended the bout before our friend got hurt, but in the craziness of the scene, my purse was stolen. All three amigos learned valuable lessons that evening. Our friend Les learned about boxing, real boxing, not the book learning kind. I learned what happens when you don't pay attention in a big city, and David probably went home and wrote an article for the university newspaper. 30 years later, I am so thrilled he is still writing for all of our enjoyment and edification, and I am thrilled that he has applied the University of Chicago method to his own personal journey of character. On behalf of the Free Library, please join me in welcoming David back to his hometown and to this center of learning and literature.
Stacy, I stole your purse. I was $60 richer after that night. That was the kosher killer. That was his nickname. That's his nickname. I was just reminded of that because a few weeks ago I spoke in the ring where the Mayweather fight just happened in Vegas in front of 16,000 women, and so I was literally in that ring at the MGM Grand, reminiscing on my days as a boxing manager. For this last speech, I was fighting Celine Dion in Vegas. I bit her ear. It's a pleasure to be back here, back in this room, back in Philadelphia, back with old friends. I've been here so many times. I know I should be brief because you didn't come here to hear me speak. You came here to hear yourself speak. And so I'll try to get out of the way of that. Now, it's a weird twist and turns to take you back to places like this, back to where my folks live in Wayne. I grew up, actually, my early childhood was spent in Lower Manhattan, near Greenwich Village in New York, to a somewhat left-wing household. In 1965, and back then I was definitely on the left, they took me to a be-in where hippies would go just to be, and they set a garbage can on fire and threw their wallets into it to demonstrate their liberation from money and material things. I saw a $5 bill on fire, so I grabbed the money. I reached in the fire, grabbed the money, and ran away. And that was sort of my first step over to the right. Sort of the twist and turn that leads, paradoxically, to being the conservative on the New York Times op-ed page, a job I likened to being chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there. Then in Lower Manhattan, I went to a place called Grace Church School. I was part of the all-Jewish boys davening choir at Grace. We would sing the hymns, but we wouldn't sing the word Jesus to square it with our religion, so the volume would drop down and then would come back up again. Actually in second grade, I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and knew I wanted to be a writer at that moment, which was super lucky to know at 7 what you're going to do with your life. And so my life was sort of organized around that. And actually, when I came out to Radnor, there was a woman, I don't know where she is these days. Her name was Bernice Hausman, and I really wanted to date her. And she wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. But people have different values. So I came out here, went to Radnor, which was weirdly celebrity-centric when I was here. My first debate partner was a guy named Tom Wilson, who played Biff in Back to the Future movies. And then my second debate partner was a guy named Josh Werman, whose father founded TED, and then he himself was the subject of the movie Twister. He now chases tornadoes around. And so we had weird celebrity out in Radnor. I think I graduated about 220 in my high school class. I was not a great student, but I did have some great teachers who I remember. My English teacher, Marianne Dusnap, who did not let me slide by with anything. You always remember the tough teachers? And she ridiculed me when I was trying to be glib and gave me a little intellectual toughness. A whole bunch of great teachers. John Dale, history teacher. It's funny to come back and remember those people. And then I met Stacy at the University of Chicago, where fun goes to die. Stacy was the only fun person in the class. And the best thing about Chicago was it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students, say Thomas Aquinas. Actually, we were reminiscing. There's this one weird event that we did. It's a very scholarly school, but there was one night when people got crazy. I'm not going to tell the story to Stacy. Don't worry. I'm going to tell the story about somebody else. And it was called the Lascivious Costume Ball, and it was where people would go more or less naked. And there was one woman who went during our years who went to the ball wearing nothing but a snake. And we have a mutual friend who we have dinner with at least once or twice a year, who he became a big hedge fund manager. And he's at a meeting 30 years later, And there's a group of people, and there's a woman on the other side of the deal. He's looking across the table, and he's like, I know that face somewhere. I know that person. And so she sees him observing her. She slides a piece of paper across the table and says, I was the one with the snake. And the fact that she has so much self-awareness that she knows that's what he would be remembering. A great triumph of human psychology. Listen, life comes with these turns. And some of them are comic that lead you in weird places. Some lead you back. It's the same rooms again and again. But some are a little more transcendent and begin you on different journeys. And my life has been so fortunate. It's been changed by good things, mostly. I do the show called The NewsHour with Jim Lehrer with a guy named Mark Shields. Our segment is called Shields and Brooks. We want to call it Brooks Shields. That would have been better, but Mark was there first. Stacy says, Mark, this segment is called Shields and Brooks. Before it was Shields and Shigo, Shields and Gergen. Before that, I think it was Shields and Coolidge. I think Shields and Aristotle. I think it started as something like that. But so I'm coming home. It was a summer about 10 years ago. My kids were then 12, 9, and 5. And I pull into my driveway, and the driveway arced around the side of the house in a place called Bethesda, Maryland. And I look in the backyard, and I happen to see my kids playing with one of those balls you get in the supermarket, a big round ball, and they're kicking it up in the air, and it's curving and arcing and blowing across the yard, and they're running across and tumbling over each other, and just laughter, playing with this ball. And the summer evening sun is coming through the trees, the grass looks perfect, and I'm just watching my kids race across the yard in hilarity, enjoying each other. And so I sit there in the driveway looking through all this through the windshield, and it's one of those moments when life and time are suspended, and when reality seems to spill outside its boundaries, and you just get an overwhelming feeling of gratitude, of a beauty that you've not earned. And this sense of getting more than you deserved elicits certain strange stirrings. First, it's a glimpse of a higher joy than you ever get in the workplace. Second, it exposes you. Your heart enlarges at moments like that. And most of all, you just want to be worthy of such moments. And so there have been certain tastes of moments where you sense some higher realm. And that can happen with an experience like that. It can happen if you're around people who radiate an inner light. Early last summer, I was happened to be seated in a Washington luncheon next to the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama is a guy who radiates that light. He also, laughs for no apparent reason. You'll see meeting, he'll just start laughing. And you want to be polite, so you laugh back. And so he laughs, you laugh. You're awkwardly trying to throw in jokes just so there's some reason for the laughter. And so I felt awkward being around him, and he has a canvas Dalai Lama bag. And it's this little thing, and I say, so you got any candy in there? And so he starts pulling out all the stuff that's in the bag, and it's basically everything you get in the first-class cabin of an international flight. So the little eye shades, earplugs, little razor, toothbrush, pulling all this stuff out, and he had a big Toblerone bar in there, so he did have that. And so that inner light is uplifting. He's a global celebrity. I was out at Frederick, Maryland, about a year ago, and I ran into about 30 women, probably aged 50 to 80, who teach immigrants how to read. This process of teaching them English and then how to read it can take years. And so when you walk in this room with these women, and they just radiate patience, and you sense their simplicity, their goodness, they're unaffected, they're unpretentious, and they just seem so joyful and happy to be alive. And their laughter was sort of musical. I remember they didn't know me from Adam, but they made me feel so important. And they weren't thinking about what good work they were doing. They just weren't thinking about themselves at all. And if you're me, you see these people and you think, well, I've achieved more career success than I ever thought I would. But that inner light that they have, I haven't achieved that. And so you want to achieve that. You only get go around in life once. You might as well try to be as good as you can. And so the way I began thinking about this problem was dividing the world into two sorts of virtues, what you might call the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. And the resume virtues are the thing we bring to the job. The eulogy virtues are the things they say about you after you're dead, whether you're courageous, brave, honorable, capable of great love. And we all know the eulogy virtues are important, more important. But a lot of us spend a lot more time thinking about the resume ones. Junior high school students were asked in a Harvard study, 10,000 of them were asked, do your parents care more about the grades you earn, or whether you're kind. And 80% said my parents care more about the grades. And frankly, thinking about my days when my kids were that age, I probably nagged them more about tests than about kindness. And so we tend to focus on the resume. And a book that helped clarify my thinking was written in 1965 by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik called The Lonely Man of Faith. And Soloveitchik says that we have two sides of our nature, what he calls Adam 1 and Adam 2. Adam 1 is the resume, the career side. Wants to build, produce, discover things, and that's a perfectly legitimate side of our nature. Adam 2 is the internal side, the moral side. Adam 2 wants to embody certain moral qualities, have a strong inner character, a solid sense of right and wrong, not only to do good, but to be good. Adam 1 wants to conquer the world. Adam 2 wants to obey a calling and serve the world. Adam 1 asks how things work. Adam 2 asks why things exist and what ultimately we're here for. Adam 1 wants to venture forth. Adam 2 wants to return to home, to roots, to family, to the warmth of a family meal, to drinks, to the buddy. And Soloveitchik says that sometimes these two sides of our nature go together. Having good character can help your career. Sometimes they conflict. I have a friend who hires a lot of people, and one of the questions he asks in the interview process is, name a time you told the truth and it hurt you. He wants to know if some people are willing to put Adam 2 first. And I'd say the two conflict because they live by different logics. Adam 1, our external side, operates by an economic logic, which is straightforward. Effort leads to reward, input leads to output, practice makes perfect. Invest, return. Adam 2 lives by a moral logic, which is an inverse logic, filled with paradoxes. You have to give to receive. You have to surrender to something outside yourself to gain strength within yourself. You have to conquer your desire to get what you crave. Success can lead to the greatest failure, which is arrogance and pride. Failure can lead to the greatest success, which is humility and learning. In order to fulfill yourself, you have to forget yourself. In order to find yourself, you have to lose yourself. And so we live in a culture, as I say, that emphasizes Adam 1 resume. It's a competitive culture. To have a good career, get in the right college, it just takes a lot of time, and you can forget the other stuff. We live in a world of fast and shallow communications. We're distracted. It's hard to have the time and solitude to hear the quiet, still voices that come from the depth. We have a moral philosophy that's prevalent in the culture that tells us to love ourselves and think extremely highly of ourselves. If you look at the commencement cliches, it's all about love yourself. You've got a little golden figure of goodness inside. Follow your passion. Be true to yourself. Trust yourself. We tell our kids how great they are, and they believe us. In 1950, the Gallup organization asked high school seniors, are you a very important person? And 12% said yes. They asked again the same question in 2005, and it wasn't 12% this time. It was 80% who said, I'm a very important person. Psychologists have these things called narcissism tests where they read statements to people, and they say, do these statements apply to you? And they're statements like, I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so extraordinary. Somebody should write a biography about me. I love to look at my body. And the median narcissism score has gone up 30% in the last 20 years. Along with this has gone an incredible desire for fame. So UCLA asked students, freshmen, what do you want out of life, in your life? What would you like? Decade after decade, the number one answer was, I'd like to have a meaningful philosophy of life. That's now ranked 16th. The number one answer is now financial security. And the number two answer, 2 or 3 most years, is fame. People really want to be famous. Junior high school girls were asked, would you rather be a celebrity's personal assistant, Justin Bieber's personal assistant, or president of Harvard? And by 3-1, they'd rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. Though to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she would rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. College students were asked, would you rather have a life that involved a lot of fame or a lot of sex? And by 2-1, they chose the fame. And I go to colleges and I say, listen, I'm on TV twice a week. I write for a prominent newspaper. I'm kind of famous. Go with the sex. It's better. But if you live that life of thinking highly of yourself, of thinking externally, the moral language just sort of drops away. There's a sociologist named Christian Smith who asks college students, name your last moral dilemma. And 70% can't name a moral dilemma. They say, I'll pull into a parking space, but I didn't have any quarters. You say, well, that's sort of a problem. It's not really a moral dilemma. But they just don't have the vocabulary. And so if you live for Adam 1, you lack the quality of inner depth. You lose the ability to speak with a sophisticated moral language about the drama that's happening inside your own soul. You live with an unconscious boredom, not really attached to highest ideals. You settle, and it's true in my life, you settle for a sort of self-satisfied moral mediocrity. You grave yourself on a forgiving curve. You think, I'm not obviously hurting anybody. People seem to like me. I must be okay. But slowly a core piece of you is turning into something a little less impressive than you originally hoped. You don't deserve the kind of magical eulogy you'd like. You don't have that inner light. And so I set out 4 or 5 years ago to figure out, how do people get that? I don't think we learn from philosophy. I think we learn from each other. So I wanted to know the people who are messes at age 20, but who become magnificent by age 70, how do they do that? And so I just looked for people like that. And the book is really trying to learn how they did it. One was a woman named Ida Eisenhower. She was born in 1862 in Shenandoah, Virginia. Her mother died when she was 5, her father when she was 10. She became an indentured servant for a family nearby. One day they were out having a picnic, and she just left. She walked to Staunton, Virginia, put herself through high school, got herself on a caravan in about 1880, and got herself out to Kansas and put herself through college. Remarkable for a young woman. In college, in 1880s. In college, she met a guy named David Eisenhower. They had 6 children, one of whom was Dwight Eisenhower. When he was 9, he wanted to go trick-or-treating. His mom, Ida, wouldn't let him. She said, "You're too young." He threw a temper tantrum. He punched the tree in his front yard so bad he rubbed all the skin off his fingers. Ida sent him to his room, let him cry for an hour, and came up to him and recited a verse from Proverbs, which was, "He that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city." When Eisenhower wrote his memoir 60 years later, he says that was the most important conversation of his life, because Ida had taught him 2 things. 1, humility, understanding that you have a weakness. And humility is not thinking lowly of yourself, it's accurate self-awareness from a distance. It's being able to step outside yourself and see your strength, but also see your weakness. And secondly, it's the knowledge that your struggle against your own weakness is the central moral drama of your life. The struggle for external success is not central. It's what's happening in here that's the central drama. And Eisenhower spent the rest of his life fighting his temper. We think of him as this garrulous country club guy. That was a constructed persona. During World War II in the presidency, he would lay at night awake, anxious, angry, insomnia, anxiety attacks, drinking, throat infections, blood pressure spiking. But he knew he could not lead but from a position of cheerful confidence. And so he created a persona and slowly made himself strong with a great temperament, what used to be his worst trait, a weak temperament. Some of the things he did were shallow. He was a big hater, so he'd write the names of the people he hated and on a piece of paper and just tear them up and throw them in the garbage can, just a way of purging. Thomas Merton wrote that souls are like athletes. They need opponents worthy of them if they are to be tried and extended and pushed to the full use of their powers. And Eisenhower, in struggling against that temper and understanding himself, practiced the art of self-defeat. Another figure is Samuel Johnson, fitting in a library, born in 1709 in England, barely survived the ordeal of his birth, handed over a wet nurse whose milk infected him with tuberculosis, rendering him blind in one eye and deaf in one ear, developed smallpox, was scarred. They performed surgery on his neck, but botched it, leaving deep gouge in his face. They opened his arms to bleed him and left the wound open for 6 years. He developed what looked like Tourette's syndrome, OCD. He was big, ogreish, ugly, and out of control. Went to Oxford for a year, failed out, started school, failed at that. By age 30, he had led a life that he said was, quote, radically wretched. But what he did and learned from those years was to take moments of suffering and put it to use. The theologian Paul Tillich says what suffering does is it takes us beneath the everydayness of life and reminds us we're not who we thought we were. It carves into what we thought was the basement of our soul, carves a hole in the floor, revealing a cavity below, and then revealing a cavity below. It gives you radical self-awareness, those moments of suffering. And Johnson saw that suffering, developed self-awareness, developed intense empathy, the way Franklin Roosevelt did after polio, and then had a great desire to turn his moments of pain into service. And he wanted to become a moral writer so people would be able to lead more virtuous lives than he was able to. He goes to England and develops a passionate rage to understand the reality. He can't control his mind, he can't control his body, but he wants to anchor himself in the realness of the truth. So he thinks he can do this through philosophy and curiosity. Told that a stretch of river was hazardous, people were drowning in it, he jumped in it to know what it felt like. Told that guns would explode if you put more than one musket ball in them, he put 7 balls in the gun and fired it against the wall. He just needed to understand. He wrote about everything that terrified him and everything that weakened him. He wrote about sloth, envy, guilt, boredom, sorrow, all the things that he suffered from. And slowly he developed a settled philosophy of life and became a very stable man and a very compassionate man. One biographer wrote, "The iron had entered his soul. He approached questions of human conduct in the light of a terrible experience which enabled him to penetrate into human motives with sureness and understanding." He was capable of amazing acts of industry. It took the French Academy 40 scholars and 50 years to write the first French dictionary. He did it alone with 6 clerks in 8 years. The first English dictionary. A friend of his got a law lectureship at Oxford, but unfortunately knew no law. So Johnson said, "Don't worry, I'll write your lectures for you." He wrote the guy 60 lectures stretching over 1,600 pages of text. He was part of the most exclusive social club in English history with Adam Smith and Edmund Burke and Joshua Reynolds. But at home he took in stray people who had nowhere else to go. He always had 10 or 13 people living with him. Former prostitutes, former slave, paupers, a doctor who had no money. He just protected them all. And by the time he died, he was recognized to be a solid, great man. A colleague wrote, "He has made a chasm which not only nothing can fill up, but which nothing has a tendency to fill up. Johnson is dead, let us go with the next best. There is nobody. No man can said to be put you in mind of Johnson." And he shows the virtues of turning moments of suffering into something worthwhile, and how curiosity and scholarship and thinking and philosophizing can be a morally solidifying act. The third person I'll mention is Francis Perkins, who was born in 1880, went to Mount Holyoke. Mount Holyoke then had rules that are different than the rules that most colleges today. Here's some rules, Mount Holyoke class of 1902. Freshmen should keep a respectful silence in the presence of sophomores. Freshmen meeting a sophomore on campus should bow respectfully. No freshman shall wear a long skirt or hair high on head before the mid-year examinations, teaching deference. They also taught character. Her worst subject was chemistry, so they made her major in chemistry, figuring if you can be strong in your weakest spot, you'll be able to ready for whatever the world throws at you. The other thing Holyoke did was they instilled this heroic ambition in their students. The slogan was, "Go where no one wants to go, do what no one wants to do." And so they sent young women alone on these service trips to Pakistan, Tibet, Africa, China. Somebody did a survey of the female missionaries abroad in about 1920, and 25% of them were Holyoke grads. Just this heroic aspiration. Perkins didn't go to abroad. She went to Chicago, to Hull House, served with Jane Addams, then sort of traveled around looking for things to do, but couldn't really find anything. She was doing good works, but it was sort of scattered. She came here in Philadelphia, and she worked to close down prostitute houses very bravely. And then in 1913, she was having tea in Washington Square in Lower Manhattan, and she heard a commotion. She rushed outside of the brownstone where she was and saw a fire. And it was one of the most famous fires in American history, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. She rushes up to it, and she thinks she sees them throwing bundles of clothing out of the 10th floor window. But it's like 9/11. People are choosing to jump to their deaths as opposed to being burned to death. And so she sees 53 people go. There's a guy helping the seamstresses across the windowsill and dropping them into space. A first, a second, a third, a fourth, his girlfriend who he kisses and then drops her, and then he himself goes. And that moment is what you might call her call within a call. She was already doing good works as a lobbyist and activist, but at that moment, she self-quieted. It wasn't about gentility, it wasn't about a reputation, it wasn't about money, it was just about serving an instrument to the cause. She became in some ways more ruthless. She would work with anybody to advance the cause. She would compromise anything. And she had this long obedience in the same direction and spent 60 years dedicated to this. She went up to Albany to become an activist, and the legislators who were, sleazy Tammany Hall pals wouldn't take her seriously. So she kept a folder called Notes on the Male Mind. And she said, they won't take me seriously as a young woman, but they all want to be loved by their mothers. So I'll remind them of their mothers. And she dressed like an 80-year-old woman. Frumpy dress, pearls, tri-corner hat, old-fashioned hairstyle, got the nickname Mama Perkins, and did some amazing legislation. First big acts of legislation, then she worked for Franklin Roosevelt, and then she became Secretary of Labor, the first female in the cabinet, where she was really the creator of the Social Security system. The little historical footnote I like, she's 83, she's retired. She's teaching because she has no money. She's spent her life doing this. So she's teaching at Cornell, but she's living alone and she's lonely. And a frat house calls her and says, well, you want to live with us? And she said she was as happy as a bride on her wedding night. So she moved in. They'd have the parties around her. She would sit there sipping bourbon. And the faculty advisor who lived in the room next to her was a guy named Alan Bloom, who then went on to write The Closing of the American Mind. And the president of the frat house that year was a guy who later served as her pallbearer, and his name was Paul Wolfowitz, the Undersecretary of Defense. Little historical paradoxes there. But she teaches how to find a vocation. And we tell our college students, look inside yourself, find your passion. Well, people have done studies of this. 80% of college graduates do not have a passion. And she found her vocation not by looking inside herself, but by looking outward to the world. It's not what do I want from life, it's what is life asking me to do? What are the circumstances of this moment asking me to do to solve? And so she looked outward and found her vocation and made such a strong commitment to it. The final person I'll mention is George Eliot, the great novelist. She was born at the start of the Victorian era to a mom who was sick, too sick to really love her or care for her, and who died early. Eliot grew up, therefore, emotionally needy, needing to be the center of attention at all times. And through her 20s, she fell in love with every guy. Young, old, tall, short, married, unmarried. She fell in love with all of those guys. The pattern was she'd fall in love with a guy, desperate for his attention. He'd give her some attention. His wife would kick her out of the house. That was the normal pattern. At age 32, she fell in love with a guy named Herbert Spencer, a great philosopher, her intellectual equal. And she wrote him a letter that is once pathetic but also profound. The first part of the letter is pathetic. She's begging him to marry her. She's saying, please, please marry me. If you marry me, you won't notice me around the house. I won't cause you any problems. If you don't marry me, I'll die. But then in the end, a little switch turns. And she writes this at the final paragraph. I suppose no woman ever before wrote such a letter as this, but I am not ashamed, for I am conscious in the light of reason and true refinement that I am worthy of your respect and tenderness. Whatever gross men or vulgar-minded women might think of me, I'm worthy of your respect. And that's a moment when she begins to develop her own internal criteria, what you might call an agency moment. There's a moment that happens, I think, often in the 30s, where you no longer need affirmation or criticism from outside. You have the ability to make up your own decisions based on your own judgments. And she developed that at that moment, that ability. Didn't work out with Spencer. She fell for a guy named George Lewis, who was also a writer. But Lewis was legally married. He had been married years before when he was young, but he and his wife were estranged. She was living with another guy, and she'd had 3 children with that other guy. And nonetheless, legally, he was married, and divorce was not an option. This is the Victorian England. And so if she's going to be with Lewis, who she loves, it's going to be considered adultery. And she will be written out of polite society. Her family cut her off. She will lose her friends. She has a couple weeks to decide, do I go with Lewis or do I go with everybody else? She decides to go with him. And she writes, I have counted the cost of the step that I have taken and am prepared to bear without irritation or bitterness, renunciation by all my friends. I am not mistaken in the person to whom I have attached myself. He is worthy of the sacrifice I have incurred. My only anxiety is that he should be rightly judged. And so hers is a story of someone who was fragmented and needy and scattered, and who is hardened and solidified by love, by a commitment to another human being. And so the first thing love does is it humbles us. It reminds us we're not in control of our own brain. Love sort of takes over. You get this intrusive thinking for your beloved. Love's like being conquered by an invading army you want to be conquered by. The second thing it does, it plows open hard ground. exposing tender flesh below, makes you vulnerable but also more joyous. The third thing love does is it decenters the self. It reminds you your riches are not in yourself, they're in another person. The fourth thing it does is it fuses you with another. Montaigne has a great essay where he says what love does is it eliminates the distinction between giving and receiving. So the friend who consents to receive a gift from his friend is doing the greater favor, giving the friend the opportunity to give the gift, and that pleasure that goes along with that. And so she experiences this poetic, idealistic, passionate love that's the young love, the kind Taylor Swift sings about. But she is also older, and she experiences also what the philosopher Roger Scruton calls a second love. This happens later in life when you're a little less idealistic, you're a little more realistic, and it's a love that is maybe less poetical but more enduring. And it's local, and it's particular, and it's mature. It's the kind of love a friend of mine named Leon Wieseltier wrote about in A Wedding Toast. He wrote, "This love is private and it is particular. Its object is the specificity of this man and that woman, the distinctiveness of this spirit and that flesh. This love prefers deep to wide and here to there, the grasp to the reach. When the day is done and the lights are out, there is only this other heart, this other mind, this other face, to assist in repelling one's demons or in greeting one's angels. It does not matter who the present is. When one consents to marry, one consents to be truly known, which is an ominous prospect, and so one bets on love to correct for the ordinariness of the impression and to call forth the forgiveness that will be required. Marriages are exposures. We may be heroes to our spouses, but we may not be idols." And she chose well. They were, for the rest of his life, 20-odd years they were together. About a year in, he says to her, you might try your hand at fiction, something she had never done. She goes away for a week, she writes a short story, she comes back and reads it aloud to him, and with halfway through he's weeping. He knows immediately the talent she has. And from that moment forth, he puts his own career second. He becomes her agent, her publicist, her editor, her consultant. She's very sensitive to criticism, so he gets up early and reads through the papers. If there's any article that mentions her, he cuts it out, so she doesn't see it. And she salutes him in the inscriptions of each of her novels. Adam Bede in 1859, "To my dear husband, George Henry Lewes, I give the manuscript of a work which would never have been written, but for the happiness which his love has conferred on my life." Felix Holt, 1866, "From George Eliot to her dear husband, this 13th year of their united life, in which the deepening sense of her own imperfectness has the consolation of their deepening love." Middlemarch, 1872, "To my dear husband, George Henry Lewes, in this 19th year of our blessed union." And so she teaches us the power of love to solidify and to give coherence and integrity and empathy and understanding to a life. So these are different aspects, things we would go to on the road to character: self-defeat, vocation, love. There are others, commitments to institutions. But if you take them as a whole, two things are common in these stories. First, there's a different viewpoint all these people had. We are grown up in an era where we think we're wonderful, we're good inside. They grew up in an era where they thought we're not that great inside. They had a philosophical different view of human nature. They believed we're divided creatures, both splendidly endowed but deeply broken. The struggle against our own weakness and sin is the central drama of life, not the external climb of success. In this struggle, humility is the greatest virtue. Humility is self-awareness. It's an understanding that you're an underdog in the struggle against your own weakness. Pride is the greatest vice. Pride blinds you to what you're really like, your self-deception. Character is built over the course of your confrontation with yourself. No person can achieve self-mastery on his or her own. We all need redemptive assistance from outside. I used to think character was this little bit of iron willpower inside of us, but none of us can defeat self-deception, selfishness that's sort of baked into our nature. We develop character by being able to commit very powerfully to things outside. In the realm of intellect, a person of character has firm convictions about fundamental issues. In the realm of emotion, she's enmeshed in a web of unconditional loves. In the realm of action, she's committed to causes that can't be completed in a single lifetime. And so they had a different philosophy. The second thing they did was they had activities. Some of them were internal, looking inside, asking, what's my core sin? How did I do today in combating it? Some of them are external, committing to a vocation, committing to a cause, committing to an institution that was here before we were born and will be there after we die. The other thing they did, their character building was not a painful process, because they did it with other people, they did it with people they cared about, and there were moments of sheer delight through it. The ambitions of Adam 1 are never satisfied. There's always something out there to grasp onto, but the ambitions of Adam 2 do subside and yield tranquility. The final thing I'll mention is a guy named Augustine, who's in my book, born in 354 in Africa, with a mom named Monica, who was the helicopter mom to beat all helicopter moms. She wants to be with him all the time, control him all the time, tell him what he can think, tell him what he can believe, tell him who to marry. He tries to get away from her by leaving Africa to go to Italy. She's on the shore screaming at him. She gets on the next boat over. She finds him. They have a life of conflict. Finally, he has his conversion, which he writes about in the Confessions. And she says to him in a garden, you know, all my life I wanted you to be a certain sort of man, a certain sort of Catholic. You are that. My work here is done. I'm ready to go. And in fact, she dies 9 days later. And he describes their conversation, which he says, after years of conflict, they had harmony. We came to our own minds and went beyond it into the realm of pure spirit. And he has a long sentence, it's hard to read, but a single word appears throughout it. The word is hushed. He says, our voices was hushed. The sound of the birds was hushed. The sound of the wind in the trees was hushed. The sound of our hearts was hushed. Everything was hushed. And you get this sense of just tranquility and a sense of gratitude for each other. And that sense of gratitude is what generates the inner light, a sense of getting way more than you deserve. And that's the sort of beauty that we taste occasionally, but the people who are leading the best sort of life have pervading their lives, and it's the thing to shoot for. Thank you. Now we have some microphones here and here. If anybody has questions, I can talk about morality or Joe Biden or Ted Cruz. I don't care. Here's one in the front here.
Today in the New York Times, by the way, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for being such a inspiration to all of us on NewsHour. I love the debate between you and Mark.
Thank you.
It's great. Today you talked about, in the Times, about the lack of in this generation particularly, a moral conversation in the public sphere. I think that was the phrase you used. And you posed some questions to all of us to write to you.
Yeah.
Is this lack something that we can actually come to grips with? I mean, you're talking about it in a very small, micro approach. Is this something that you feel this generation has the capacity, really, with all of the distractions and with all of the indifference, to looking at these questions internally? And I wonder whether you, what you hope for us.
Right. So, I had asked. There used to be public intellectuals like Reinhold Niebuhr, Abraham Joshua Heschel. These were sort of moral figures that were on the public stage, and in my view, there's nobody quite like that. Or even intellectuals like Hannah Arendt or Jean-Paul Sartre with more secular philosophies. And that was more common then. Now we have a political culture, in my view, that is over-politicized and under-moralized. So we have plenty of talk shows about politics, and I'm on them. But, I write columns about politics, and the interest is here. I write columns about morality and culture. The interest is up here. There's just much more demand. And so I've written books about social neuroscience, and that book did very well, but every day the interest in this book is about 50 or 60% higher. There's just a lot of pent-up demand for this sort of conversation. And so in my column today, I asked people to go to my website, which is theroadtocharacter.com, and send me an essay on if I found my purpose, if I know what the purpose of my life is, how did I find it? And I asked because I run into so many people, and especially my students where I teach, who they're desperate. They know life should have a purpose. They don't know how to find it. They don't have the vocabulary to find it, but they're so hungry. And I find in the younger generation, maybe more than any generation, they've lived in such a competitive world, and I teach at Yale, so it's a unique strata. I ask my kids, what are you doing in spring break? It's always like, well, I'm unicycling across Thailand while reading to lepers. It's that sort of thing. But they say, one of them said to me, we're so hungry. They're so hungry to feel morally fulfilled, and they're so hungry to find a commitment. They have what they call FOMO, fear of missing out, and that means they want to try everything. But to really lead a life of integrity, you got to commit to one thing. You got to say 1,000 no's for a few precious yeses, and they have trouble with that. But they certainly find that. I found it doesn't matter if you're young or old. People are born with a moral imagination. They want to lead righteous lives, and it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. Everybody has this.
This may not be a question about Ted Cruz necessarily, but as you look at the presidential candidates out there right now, growing by the minute, do you see any elements of what you would describe as the Adam 2 characteristics in any of them?
Yeah. So we'll see. We have I will say in general, so I don't know with a lot of the candidates. I think they're probably decent human beings, but I tell you the process of being in politics now, what it does is it drains away the inner voice. So we all say things that are part of our job that is sort of our outward display, but hopefully we go home and we have an inner voice that is our true self. I remember I was reading, John Hay was one of Lincoln's aides in the White House, and he was writing press releases, as one has to, and the press releases were to build morale. We're winning this war, the war's going great, General Meade is a genius, every move he makes is brilliant. And then Hay was writing diaries to himself. And in the diaries he's writing, it's a disaster, we're losing General Meade, what a schmuck, he's an idiot. And so he was, at least he had an inner voice. But I find a lot of politicians, their lives are so public, they are their own product. They hollow themselves out. And when you can get close to them, you can talk off the record, and their self-interest becomes their opinion. And so it's just a huge character challenge for them to step outside the role and actually have a conscience and have a conscious voice. And I find that's harder and harder as they get busier and more public and they become more the product. You want to go over on the side either way? Okay.
How do you deal with your own children? Are they the 80% that think they're very special? They probably are, but how do you teach them the humility and character that you are talking, and kindness that you're talking about tonight?
Yeah. My kids are great because I'm such an amazing father. I'm not. I'll say one thing. I think we learned weirdly through sports. My kids, despite my build, were athletic. And one's 24, one's 20, and one's 16 now. And so we learned sports produces a lot of failure. And my boys were pitchers, and they would get bad outings. And my daughter played defense in hockey. She led in a goal. And you learn failure. And I think one of the things that was nice that we learned out of that was the rest of the world will criticize. We'll be in their corner. Let the rest of the world criticize. They will get a relentlessly positive message from us. And so that's, I don't want to praise myself as a father. I had ups and downs like anybody. But one thing I see in where I teach is about 20% of the kids are plagued by terror. And their terror is that they're going to lose the love of their parents. And that's because their parents love them, and their parents do not perceive this at all, by the way. Their parents love them, and their parents worry about them and want them to be successful. And when the kids are doing something the parents think will lead to success, they're so proud of them. When the kids are doing something the parents do not approve of, they're so panicked, and the beam of love is withdrawn. And so these kids are living under the reign of conditional love. And they assume conditional love is part of the structure of the universe that you have to earn and perform to get love. And they're afraid if they don't perform, if they don't follow what the parents want, the love will be withdrawn and that'll all be gone. And it's not most of my kids, but it's a percentage. And I see how it dissolves their inner criteria. I see how they have, in some ways, a lot of self-confidence, but a lot of inner terror, and how they become risk-averse. Just once I'd like to have a kid come up to me and say, you know, I really want to major in finance, but my parents are insisting I major in art history. That never happens. And so for some reason the parents are just forcing them to be overly practical. And the one thing I tell the kids, and I think a lot of us who see this have an aversion to this, I tell the kids, your first year out of college, your only job is to widen your horizon of risk. Your first job out of college is probably going to suck. But you can take a job that will take you far afield outside your comfort zone, and forever after, your horizon of risk will be like this, because you'll know you've done that. If you take a conventional job, your horizon of this risk will be like this, and for the rest of your life, it'll be like this. So just widen your horizon. And I'm sure parents hate that, but it's good advice.
I think I want to ask the first question, but in a slightly different way. So to what extent, if any, do you think that the almost unrelenting focus on selfishness and greed, especially over the last 35 years, has played a part in changing the public discussion about morality? And if you think that has, do you think that conservatives who don't work for the New York Times are complicit?
Are there conservatives who don't work at the New York Times? Listen, I'd say that we've seen an increase in individualism, and I think that's been a bipartisan achievement. Economic individualism is what conservatives tend to mention. Moral and social individualism is what liberals tend to emphasize. And so we've weakened the collective and the community and strengthened the individual. And there's been a lot of individual liberation going on. And I think some of it was really good and necessary, but it's gone too far. And second, I think there's been a rise of consumerism. And this was especially prevalent after World War II. They'd been through the Depression, they'd been through the war. They just wanted to relax and spend. And and when they did that, advertising took off, Mad Men. And the message was, trust your desires. If you desire it, you deserve it. And that was not an ethos that George Eliot believed or Dwight Eisenhower's mom believed. And so there was a great liberation of desire and trust your desires. And so I do think that then the shift didn't happen in the 60s. It happened in the 40s, late 40s. And then Carl Rogers came along with positive psychology that said, love yourself, you're perfect inside. The Power of Positive Thinking came out. You're good inside, you're good inside. That was #1 bestseller for 98 straight weeks. Dr. Spock came out with his baby book, which had many great qualities, but one of them was, in the early editions, if your child steals something, just give him what he stole and tell him he can have what he wants if he just asks for it. Well, I think that's based on a very rosy view of human nature. And so there was just this rosy view that came out, and I think that was the big cultural shift. And so I do think we need to return a little back to, and not go back to the dark ages. Believe me, you never want to go back to the past. No era in the past do we want to go back to. The 1940s, racist, sexist, terribly boring food. But in this one respect, the sense of self and the smallness of self, I think they have something we can learn from and modernize.
I'd like to ask a question that I hope will blend the morality with the politics that you enjoy. Barney Frank was here last month, and he talked about eliminating the triad that we spend for nuclear weapons between sort of the Navy, the Air Force, and I don't know who else has the nuclear weapons, but anyway. So
The
I guess
Environmental Protection Agency has a lot of
whatever. But I guess my question is: do you think anyone running for president would have the character to raise this? Because his point was that money could be spent to give kids in the inner city jobs, to have construction jobs, to pay good wages and things like that. And instead, we're spending it on, this militarism that your hero Ike warned against.
Yeah, so he did warn against the military-industrial complex. Yeah, it occurs to me that we don't need. I'm not an expert on this, but can't remember how many nuclear warheads we have. I think it's way down than it used to be in the Cold War, but how do we know we need so many? I don't know how much it costs to have these nuclear warheads. I guess the thing I've always questioned is, I hope nobody is offended by this, why we need so many battleship or aircraft carrier groups. Like, who are we fighting with these things? When China does something, we send them out sort of as a display of force, but I can't imagine it intimidates anybody. And so I'm not sure why we need some of that spending, and I'm not sure why every branch of the military has to have an Air Force, if we've already got an Air Force. Maybe we don't need the Air Force, I don't know. But there's a lot of duplication there. But, the elemental fact of our spending is the elemental fact, and I can say this in this room because I hope I can outrun most of you. We spend way too much on health care for affluent seniors. And the government is a gigantic redistribution machine from young, struggling families to affluent elderly. And basically we have to turn that around and get the redistribution going the other way. But that's where the big money is. And I'll say one final thing is, there are certain political beliefs that you and I can hold. But one of the purposes of this book, and believe me, I care about politics, I write about it all the time, is to defend a space that's more foundational than politics. One of my characters, Samuel Johnson, wrote a couplet, "Of all the things human hearts endure, how few are those that kings can cause and cure." Meaning, what matters in our life is our relationships, the intimate spheres, the moral struggles. And that's influenced by politics, but it's beyond the realm. And I only say that because I was alarmed by a survey study that I saw. In 1970, people were asked, would you mind if your son or daughter married somebody of the opposing party? And in 1970, 5% would mind. Today, 40% would mind. And so to me, that's over-politicization. I don't know. If my kids come home with children they want to marry, or not, hopefully they'll be adults by then. I hope, before I ask about the political party, I'll ask a lot other questions first before I get down to that one. So maybe one more, maybe up there in the aisle, up there.
You said that you embarked on this road to character study about 5 years ago. Was there an incident or incidents which prompted you to undertake this discovery?
Not really. It wasn't like a midlife crisis or anything. It was just the gradual sense that we have a responsibility to try to get better every day. And I just developed an interest in reading about it. And there really wasn't a book to help me, sort of a guidebook. There were a lot of religious books. And so I read a lot of Jewish theologians like Joseph Soloveitchik. I read a lot of Christian theologians, whether it was C.S. Lewis or Reinhold Niebuhr. But I'm a secular writer, and I write for the secular world. You can be religious, not religious, I don't care. But I think there's a public discussion which is not explicitly within a single religious tradition. And there wasn't a book in the public world that had some of the wisdom that Augustine knew or that Abraham Joshua Heschel knew. And in the secular world, it just felt inarticulate, and I felt inarticulate. And so I'm a product of the culture we're in, and it just felt like this mystery to me. How do people become good? And I had written a piece about Princeton called The Organization Kid, and the kids there worked really hard, and I went around, this was like 10 or 15 years ago, and I went to the faculty, you guys teach character development here at Princeton? And they said, no, we really don't know how. And so I didn't know how either. And it seemed like I should figure that one out. And I can tell you right now that reading a book or writing a book on character does not get you there. But hopefully it gives you a roadmap, and then hopefully you can live it out. And the reason I chose biographies was in part because of an email I got from a guy named Dave Jolly, who was a veterinarian who wrote to me when I was writing, in response to some column. Let me see if I can find what he wrote to me. And it was a column about how tough it was to teach morality in a classroom. Give me 1 minute. Here it is. He said, "What a wise person teaches is the smallest part of what they give. The totality of their life, of the way they go about it in the smallest details, is what gets transmitted. Never forget that. The message is the person, perfected over lifetimes of effort that was set in motion by yet another wise person, hidden from the recipient in the dim mists of time. Life is much bigger than we think, cause and effect intertwined in a vast moral structure that keeps pushing us to do better, become better, even when we dwell in the most painful, confused darkness. I think we do have that impulse in us to do better, to become better. And the things that help us along the way is not an abstract philosophical argument. It's a person." I love these phrases. What a wise person teaches is the smallest part of what they give. It's the totality of their life. The message is the person. And so when I now have these 10 figures, the Eisenhowers and those people, in my head as sort of friends. And when I think back on my teachers at Radnor, I can barely remember what I was taught, the substance of it, but I remember certain teachers, Mr. Dale, Miss DeCenzo, Miss Dewsnap, I remember the way they were. And so I just wanted to be around people, living or dead, who are a certain way and hope it would rub off. Thanks.